The Settings API is an API I'm not particularly fond of, but that doesn't mean it's not used. What the Settings API allows you to do is create a form that will be handled by WordPress. This means that you don't have to do what we did in the previous lectures. You don't have to process the form yourself, manage the options, or create your own UI. The Settings API is meant to solve all of that. Now keep in mind that it's completely optional to use the Settings API. Creating your own UI is completely acceptable. It's a common route for developers to use. I highly prefer creating my own UI and processing the data myself. With that being said, you may prefer to use the Settings API. This lecture is meant to introduce you to the API and how it works. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Settings API plugin handbook chapter. This page describes the Settings API in detail. If you scroll down, they even talk about why you should use the Settings API. The benefits are that it provides visual consistency, it's future-proof, and it means less work. It takes care of handling form submission, security measures, and data sanitization. Feel free to read over this chapter. Let's get started with the Settings API. The very first thing I'm going to do is open the Options page. I'm going to place the Settings API form right below our custom one so that we can compare the item. Add a horizontal line separator and then create another form. This form will have two attributes which are action and method. The method will be post. The action will be options.php. This is the first difference right here. The custom UI form has an action of admin-post.php. Requests that will be handled and processed by you should be sent to the admin-post.php file. The options.php is exclusively for the Settings API. Keep in mind that WordPress will handle all the form submissions and data sanitization for you, so you'll have to send the data to the options.php file if you plan on using the Settings API. Alright, moving on. Inside this form, we're going to call three functions. The first function is the settings fields. This function will output some hidden fields that will help with security and help WordPress identify what group of options are being submitted. Option groups are an important concept to remember. It's really confusing to beginners, but I'll try my best to explain it. If you look inside the activation file, we create a single option and assign its value to an array. This array has multiple settings, but to WordPress it's all considered one single row in a database. If we wanted to, we could have created two options by calling the addOption function twice and storing these values separately rather than inside of an array. That's an acceptable situation to WordPress. It's what WordPress does with its own settings. It's why when you open the options database table, you saw many individual values rather than arrays. Go to the admin dashboard and under the settings menu select any page. I'm going to select general. Each field in this form has its own option or database row in the options table. For example, the site title has its own row. The tagline also has its own row. So on and so forth. It's a lot of settings, but it just means that WordPress considers each value important enough to have its own row in the options database table. In our case, I don't consider each plugin setting important enough to have its own row in the database. I just group them all together. It's easier to manage and remember. Here comes the problem with creating individual rows for each setting. WordPress is completely unaware if certain options are related to one another. Back to the settings page, you'll notice that even though these are separate options, they're all grouped and managed together in this single form. In order for this to work, WordPress requires that they be grouped together. This is where option groups come into play. Even though each value exists in its own row, they can be grouped together so that WordPress can keep track of everything. When you create an option group, you make it easier for WordPress to know which field belongs to which section and which section belongs to which page. You'll see how we generate sections and fields in just a second. Back to the options page, I'm going to pass in a custom option group called rOptsGroup. Any options assigned to this group will be managed here is what I'm telling WordPress. Now that WordPress knows what group of options are going to be managed, I can begin creating the fields themselves. The next function I want to call is doSettingSections. This will output the actual input fields themselves. We have to tell WordPress what sections we'd like to output. This function accepts the page name. Since this is a custom page, we can input a custom page name. The page name will be r_opt_sections. We haven't talked about sections, but sections are a way to group individual input fields together. You can have multiple sections, so this function will get all sections that are grouped together. If that seems confusing, don't worry, you'll see how it works in just a moment. The last function I want to call is submit_button. This will generate a submit button that is styled to work with the form. It's very simple. Keep in mind that you don't have to call these functions. We could, if we wanted to, create the fields and buttons ourselves. However, that would defeat the purpose of using the Settings API in the first place, since its job is to handle everything for us. That's it for the form. Let's begin registering everything. The Settings API instructs us that we have to register everything from the admin init hook. Open this function now. Just to keep things organized, I'm going to separate the registration from the rest of the code. Create a new file named settings-api.php and define the function rSettingsAPI. Include this file from the admin init function and then just call this function at the very end of the function. We can now put all our code inside the newly defined function. The first step is to register the new settings. Call the function registerSetting. Pass in the option group name, which is r_opt_group, and the actual option, which is r_opts. This function will tell WordPress that the r_opts option is assigned to the group r_opts_group. This function needs to be called for as many options we have. For example, if we had 3 options, we'd call this function 3 times, where the second argument is for each option. The group should always be the same if all the options are going to be displayed on the same page. For instance, if I had something like option 2 and option 3, then I would pass that in like so. However, since we saved our option as an array, we only have one row in the database. As a result, we only have to call this function once. Now that we've called this function, WordPress will know that the r_opts options will be handled by the Settings API. The next step is to create a section. A section is a way to group individual fields. A single page can have multiple sections, and each section may have multiple fields. It's just a way to keep things organized. Since we only have 2 fields in the array, we only really need one section. Call the function addSettingsSection. This function has 4 parameters. The first parameter is a custom ID. I'm going to keep it simple and name it Recipe Settings. The second parameter is a readable name which will be outputted onto the screen. Set this to Recipe Settings. The third parameter is a function that will be called before the fields are displayed. Set this to rSettingsSection. Define this function right below and echo out the text. You can change the recipe settings here. You can output whatever you want. Most developers will just output some text that will help users out when filling out the form. The last parameter is the name of the page this will appear on. In our case, we named it rOptSection. Any fields assigned under this section will appear on the page this section is assigned to. In the options page, we called the doSettingSection function, which will output any sections that are assigned to the page rOptSection. This is how you connect the two. Now that we have our sections, we can begin creating the input fields. Creating fields is a pretty straightforward process. Right after the section, call the function addSettingsField. This function has quite a few parameters. The first parameter is the ID for this field. Technically, you can give this field any ID you'd like, but I'd like to assign it to the option that it's relevant to. This field will be related to the Rating Login Required option. The second parameter is the label text that will be displayed for this field. I'm going to use the same text I used in the custom UI form. The third parameter is the function that will be called for the actual input itself. I like to use the same name as the ID with the addition of _input_CB, where CB stands for callback. You'll see what this function does in a moment. The fourth parameter is the page that this field belongs to. This is the same as the name we passed in the do settings sections function. The fifth parameter is the name this section belongs to, which is the value we passed into the first parameter of the add settings section. The next step is to define the function that we called in the third parameter. This function will output the input field. I'm going to grab the ROPTS option like before. Then I'm going to borrow this bit of code from the custom form we created. I want to change two things. First, I want to create an ID. The ID should match the ID you assigned in the first parameter of the relative add settings field function. Next, I want to change the name attribute. It's very important that you name this attribute correctly. The name will determine what option is updated in the database. In our case, it would be the ROPTS option. However, this option is not a single value. If it was, then this would be perfectly acceptable. To tell WordPress that we want to update a certain key in the array, we need to use square brackets and pass in the name of the key. In this case, it would be Rating Login Required. It's very important that you name it correctly or the options will not be updated accordingly. That's it for the first field. I'm going to just copy everything from the first field and just update its values accordingly for the second option. I'm going to do the same with the function as well. Your code should look similar to mine. Once you're finished adding the second field for the second key in the ROPTS array, we can now test the form. Refresh the options page. You should now see the form appearing right below. Without changing a value, try submitting the Settings API form. You should receive no errors and you should still have the same values in both forms. Now try updating one field and save the changes. You should see the change reflected in both forms. These two forms do the exact same thing, but one is custom and the other is created using the Settings API. There is no wrong answer here. You'll find that plugins and themes will use either solution. Personally, I like to create my own UI. I find it easier to manage, but you may not feel that way. You may like to handle everything through PHP without having to worry about the CSS and JavaScript. That's perfectly fine. Use the solution that suits you. Before I end this lecture, I want to do one more thing. I want to sanitize these values myself using the Settings API. Doing that is very simple. Go back to the Settings API file. I'm going to minimize everything for a moment so that you can read the code better. The register setting function has a third parameter which is optional but can be taken advantage of. The third parameter accepts a function that will sanitize the input when it's submitted. The name of this function will be ROPTSSanitize. Define this function at the very bottom. This function will be passed in the input. This input should have two values. All I'm going to do is sanitize both these values by running them through the absInt function. This will make sure the values are numbers and are absolute. Lastly, you just return the input so that WordPress can update the option. That pretty much wraps it up for the Settings API. We will keep working on this plugin, but I won't be using the Settings API form anymore. I'm just going to comment it out with HTML comments.